Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Russia's President Putin says he wants the United States to explain why it is pulling out of a landmark nuclear weapons treaty. The agreement, signed 30 years ago, eliminated short to intermediate range nuclear missiles. Well, President Trump has accused Moscow of developing a weapons system that violates the agreement. Here's our North America correspondent Chris Buckler, and a warning: there is flash photography in his report.
This was a moment and an image that let the world know that the Cold War was coming to an end. 3 decades ago, the then American president and Soviet leader agreed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that led to hundreds of missiles in both countries being destroyed. But that was a different era. While the nuclear threat isn't what it once was, for years America has been concerned about Russia's testing and deployment of a cruise missile that it says breaches the INF Treaty. And with concerns that other countries, including China, aren't tied by the accord, Donald Trump says he's had enough.
We're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to. We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
The president has spent the week campaigning ahead of next month's crucial congressional elections. He's visited troops posed with missiles, and now he's talking tough about Russia. Some will say he's thinking about domestic concerns as well as international ones. And there are some members of his own Republican Party worried about Mr. Trump undoing the work of one of his presidential predecessors.
I think it's a big, big mistake to flippantly get out of this historic agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev signed. This was a big part of Reagan's legacy, and we should not get rid of it.
The US National Security Advisor John Bolton is visiting Moscow, where he will meet with Russian leaders. But they already know what he plans to say. And over the last year, President Putin has accused America of bad faith and attempting to destroy the treaty.
They
are constantly searching for some violations from our side and are consistently doing it themselves.
Mikhail Gorbachev, who signed the treaty with Ronald Reagan, today warned that withdrawing from the agreement was a dangerous step backwards and threatened what was once seen as an historic leap forward. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Washington.
Russia has criticised US President Donald Trump after he announced that he was pulling America out of a Cold War treaty that restricts the development of short-range tactical nuclear weapons. It's fuelled fears of a new arms race between the two nuclear superpowers. Well, our correspondent Juliet Bremner is in Washington for us and joins me live. Juliet, why has the president made this announcement now?
Well, to be fair, this predates the Trump administration by at least 4 years. President Obama was accusing the Russians of doing the same thing, but he was persuaded by his European allies that he shouldn't abandon the treaty. Perhaps predictably, President Trump is taking a harder line. This is what he had to say about moving away from this treaty.
We're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to. We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement.
Now, the Russians are criticising this, and perhaps predictably, they deny that they've been breaking it. But there is a lot of evidence that points to the fact, which is backed up by NATO, that they have been developing these intermediate-range missiles. Got to remember that this all dates back more than 30 years. That was when Gorbachev signed a deal with Ronald Reagan in 1986. But of course, much has changed since then, and President Trump and his hawkish allies have been keen to escalate their capabilities as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. They fear particularly the threat from China, and despite some voices of dissent amongst Republicans in the Senate, this is not seen as another Trump bluff to bring the Russians to the negotiating committee. Everyone assumes that he means what he says this time, and it's a message that will be reinforced by his national security advisor when he visits Moscow next week.
Juliet, thank you.
Russia's former president Mikhail Gorbachev has said that Donald Trump is making a mistake by abandoning a key nuclear weapons treaty originally signed in 1987. Mr. Trump claimed that Moscow had not honored the agreement, so the US would pull out. Russian officials have denounced the move, one saying that it meant that mankind is facing full chaos in the nuclear weapons sphere. Here's Simon Israel.
16 подписей.
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev when times were different. Their signatures were to herald a less threatening age, a treaty that would restrict the nuclear arms race, a treaty that has held for 31 years. Last night in Nevada, President Trump announced he was ready to rip it up. In his view, the Russians have been violating the treaty for years. In other words, the president's nuclear button may no longer be the biggest as he once boasted.
Russia has violated the agreement. They've been violating it for many years, and I don't know why President Obama didn't negotiate or pull out. And we're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to.
The stage was set in March this year, when the Russian leader unveiled the country's nuclear weapons future, with missiles that can evade detection. President Putin warned the West Russia intended to remain a major nuclear state. No one has listened to us, he said.
Нас никто не слушал.
You listen to us now.
Послушайте сейчас.
Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, tonight will be back in Moscow. His boss has set the tone for talks with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. His deputy responded to Trump's claims by accusing the US of flagrant violations and the president of wanting total military supremacy. But for the US, there are other strategic reasons. China is building up its nuclear arsenal with no restrictions and is not a signatory to any treaty. In this year's State of the Union address, Donald Trump's ambitions were made perfectly clear.
As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression.
Trump's announcement to abandon the missile treaty has triggered unease. Germany says it's regrettable, while the UK backs the decision, saying Russia needs to get its house in order. An era lasting 3 decades appears to be coming to an end.
Though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is doviai no proviai, trust but verify.
And the one surviving signatory to that trust, Mikhail Gorbachev, said tonight, Trump's decision does not come from a wise mind.
Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director of the Royal United Services Institute, and I asked him if Trump had a point. Are the Russians cheating?
Yes, I think the balance of evidence suggests that they are. The Americans have not provided publicly the detailed information on which they base this, but the Russians have been given chances over the last 4 years to answer these charges, and they've declined to do so. So I think we must assume the Russians are in violation.
So is Trump doing the right thing here?
No, I don't think he is. I think this will escalate the situation. The Americans actually don't have any options of their own for deploying the sort of missiles limited by this treaty, and this will allow the Russians to do a lot more quickly than they've been able to do so far. So certainly in the next 2 or 3 years, it will provide more advantage to the Russians. I think it's also the case that the Russians have concerns of their own about related systems, which could have been part of a discussion with the United States. But most of all, I think the reason this treaty is now falling apart is because neither the Russians nor the Americans, certainly the hawks on both sides, are very interested in maintaining it, not least because both are increasingly concerned about China being able to deploy this sort of missile without any constraint.
But are you saying that despite his huffing and puffing, Trump is actually doing the Russians a favor by pulling out of this treaty?
I think the treaty has been on life support for the last couple of years. And what has kept it going most of all is that neither side wanted to take the blame for pulling the plug on it. And now the United States has. And although the proximate cause of this crisis is the Russian violation, the Russians will be pleased, I think, that the Americans will take much of the blame, not least with their European allies, for bringing this treaty to a close.
So this is bad news for Europe?
I think it's bad news for Europe and for Asia. I think we saw, beginning with the annexation of Crimea, then the action in Syria, we've been moving back towards a world in which great power military competition is really important. And this is a further twist in that spiral, I fear. So the next crisis could well be with the only remaining nuclear arms treaty there will be after this treaty goes, which is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which constrains long-range missiles in America and Russia. And that, I think, is now at serious risk. Most Republicans in the Senate voted against this treaty when President Obama took it there. And there are Republicans in this administration, certainly, who would like to move beyond that. If that happens, which could happen during Trump's first term, then we will be left with no nuclear arms control treaty for the first time since the 1970s.
And in a line, is the world a more dangerous place today?
I think this has opened up the possibility of greater danger. Yes, I think the world is moving into a more dangerous place when we're going to have to think more about the nuclear balance, the military balance between our major powers than we've have had to do for the last 25 years.
Malcolm Chalmers, thank you very much indeed.
I've been